Welcome, everyone. My name is Jennifer Guittard, and I have the privilege of serving as program co-chair of IPAC Nova Scotia. On behalf of my colleagues at the Institute of Public Administration of Canada, I'm pleased to welcome you all here for what will be an exciting look back at the characters who've served as Premier of Nova Scotia over the past half century. We'll be taking your questions throughout the event, so if you have a question you'd like to ask, please enter it into the chat in YouTube. And towards the end of the discussion, we'll reserve some time to bring in audience questions. Moving things along, I'd like to introduce our moderator for this evening's fireside chat, Tracy Barbrick. Tracy is the Associate Deputy Minister of the Nova Scotia Department of Seniors and Long-Term Care. Tracy's provincial government career began in 2001 and has spanned multiple departments, including environment, health and wellness, labor and advanced education, and community services, and most recently included leading the province's COVID-19 vaccine rollout. Welcome, Tracy. Pleased to have you here. And I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you very much. It's nice to see you both here on the screen. And Graham, welcome all the way from Nunavut.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
So I'm really looking forward to the next hour. I read I think the reason I was asked to host this discussion was IPAC had done a little list of books that are on your nightstand that you intend to read early in the new year, and your book was one of them. So I got a call shortly after asking if I was interested in interviewing you. So I jumped at the chance. Thanks for being with us. So a little bit about you for those that maybe don't know already, which I can't quite imagine, but Graham Steele is a Rhodes Scholar from Winnipeg, which I don't think I knew, a lawyer, and 12 years as a politician, holding many hats during that time, including the Minister of Finance, Minister of Economic and Rural Development. And my memory takes me back to in the early days of when you first became Minister of Finance, your courage in the community conversations around back to balance, which I think are not an easy tackle to introduce the idea that all these things are opportunity cost and decisions have to be made. So, and from there, off you went to be a broadcaster of CBC Information Morning's weekly political commentary, and most recently an author of now 3 books, I think, if I have that right, and I have read them all. And now you are in Nunavut as the Information and Privacy Commissioner, so you've been a busy guy.
I have indeed, and thanks very much. It's a delight for me to be here today, and I have a lot of respect for IPAC. I used to be a member myself back when I was a young lawyer, and then a civil servant in the 1990s. I have a lot of respect for the organization. I got a lot out of it when I was a member. I did give up my membership when I went into politics, but I'm very pleased to be invited to speak to IPAC. And so because of the audience, I'm going to orient a lot of my remarks today towards a civil service audience. I know not every single person is a civil servant, but I know most people are sort of public administrators or adjacent. So hopefully we'll have a chat that's interesting to everybody.
Yeah, okay, so let's dig in. But before we start, Graham, I have a couple of quick snappers for you. Just to get us used to being on this screen, talking to a nameless, faceless crowd that we can't see. What are you reading right now?
What am I reading right now? I'm reading everything that I can get my hands on about Nunavut, and there's actually quite a lot. I knew a little bit about Canada's North before I came up here, I think like most Canadians, but like most Canadians probably it didn't amount to very much. And I've just been absolutely fascinated by the culture, the history, learning about Canada's North and the Inuit people. People may be aware that Nunavut is about 85% Inuit. And so this is wonderful learning because, I love reading history. So now I'm reading history about Canada's North, learning about the culture and trying to pick up as much as I can of the Inuit language. That's mostly what I'm focusing on these days.
Yeah, I bet that's a fascinating experience because I think that, schools do maybe a little better job today talking about the breadth of Canada, but certainly when I went to school, that wasn't a culture that I learned very much about. So I bet you that's fascinating.
It's funny, Tracy, when you go online and see people talking about Nunavut, the thing that they complain about, at least older people like me, is how hard it is to color in Nunavut when you're in elementary school. It just takes so long and it's so big.
How much crayon.
Exactly.
Okay, what have you hated about COVID and what have you liked?
My, oh my. Well, obviously the inability to socialize. Now, I moved up to Nunavut a year ago to be the Information and Privacy Commissioner, and it's been very difficult, to socialize, to get involved in the community because everything was shut down tight. In fact, when I flew up here, they still had the isolation hubs in operation where you had to spend 2 weeks in isolation from anybody in my case, a hotel in Ottawa before flying up at all. And then once I got up here, nobody was going out and getting to see each other. So it's been a very slow integration into the community for me. And also just not being able to see family and friends and watching the pressure on the frankly on the mental health of family and friends. That's been no fun at all. If there's been a bright side to COVID, that sounds strange even to say it, but this book is my COVID project.
Oh,
just in case anybody in the audience doesn't know what it looks like. This is what it looks like. So what happened was I was teaching at Dalhousie, which I loved and would have done to retirement if I could have, but they didn't renew my contract there because of a budget crunch, or at least that's what they told me. And then it took a while for this job to come through because COVID had really slowed down the hiring process up here. So I had time on my hands. And then a publisher, namely Leslie Choice of Pottersfield, contacted me through a mutual friend and say, hey, I have this idea for a book. So it was this happy conjunction of I had the time, obviously I had the interest, and I have the publisher, which if you're going to write a book, I can't emphasize enough what a difference it makes to have a publisher who's ready to bring your book to market. It just means that the author can focus on writing. So all of those things came together. And this book is essentially my COVID project.
Well, that's a great project then. So that's interesting. So when the publisher came to you about the book, were they looking for sort of a history of Nova Scotia politics, or they were just looking for a book and this was where you went?
No, it's kind of a funny story because the publisher, Leslie Choice, great guy, wonderful guy. He's published over 100 books in his own name. Isn't that incredible? Like over 100 books by himself. And then he publishes other people's books. Anyway, he had this idea about an irreverent history series, like irreverent history of this, that, and the other thing about Nova Scotia. And his first two ideas, and this sounds odd, were politics and beer, not the same book, but an irreverent history of politics and an irreverent history of beer. And he already had an idea of the guy who'd write the beer book, and he did. Stephen Lafferty is a well-known author, person around Halifax. And they asked me if I'd write the irreverent history of Nova Scotia politics. Stephen knew that I like to write, and I started, but I realized that I couldn't really write an irreverent history. I had to write a straight up history because, first of all, there hadn't been one for like well over 30 years. The last one in this vein had been published in 1988. And as I got into it, I thought, no, forget this irreverent history thing. I just need to write a straight up history, lively, entertaining, easy to read for a general audience, because there isn't one out there, and I think people might find it interesting. So it started out with a certain idea, but because the series hadn't even started yet, there was no template. So Leslie basically let me go where I wanted. My only condition was I wasn't going to go any further back than 1945 because I didn't think that would be interesting to people, and it's not particularly interesting to me. But the reason we picked 1945 as a starting date is in order to understand what's going on today, you really have to start about there.
Well, and I must say, as having just turned 50, it felt like a history book for me, because it really is close enough in the near history that I can tangibly see the pieces that connect in the world that I work in every day. So it couldn't have been better time frame for those of us that are still in this business. Okay, so we're set to jump into some other questions. So throughout the book, you play with that tension around economic development and historical premiers' role in decisions around economic development. Now, one of them that's a bit of a cautionary tale in the book is the Westray experience. Do you mind talking about your thinking about that as the significant influence that it had in that space?
Yeah, sure. It's something that's really interesting, even for me, because, I knew the broad outlines of this, but I really delved into it deep for purposes of writing the book. And you start in the post-war world with Angus L. MacDonald, the icon of the Liberal Party, and premier for like 20 years, and he was a cabinet minister in Mackenzie King's war cabinet in Ottawa during the Second World War. But his thing was, well, first of all, he instituted Nova Scotia's system of old age pensions. We all know that's been taken over by the federal government, but that back then it was a provincial responsibility, and he instituted it and then talked about it for the rest of his political career as one of his greatest accomplishments. But other than that, his thing was building things. So he dealt with the depression of the 1930s by paving roads, which leads in a whole other direction of Nova Scotia politics, and rural electrification. And those were good things, but it's relatively easy for governments to build things as long as they don't have to operate them. And I found that even during my time in government, that finding capital spending was relatively straightforward. It's operating funding that Tracy, and other civil servants know, that's always the catch. And then Robert Stanfield came in, the conservative icon, after Angus L. MacDonald died in 1954. Stanfield became premier in 56, and he had a totally different conception. And that is, and I talk about this in the book, that the number one job, the primary job of government, is to build industry. And I raised the question in the book: is that really the case? Is that really what governments are for? I don't try to answer that. I'm just saying to people, this is a debatable idea, but it really started with Stanfield, that was the primary purpose of government. And every government since then has taken to be their primary job, or one of their primary jobs, to try to attract industry, grow industry, create jobs. And, it's really worth asking the question whether it has worked or not. Even Stanfield's own record, by far his biggest success was the Michelin plants, which nobody can question have been a good thing for the economy of Nova Scotia, so that for many, many years, maybe even still today, the number one export of Nova Scotia was rubber tires. And you look at Nova Scotia and say, how did that become our number one export? It was because of Michelin. But then there were some big failures as well. Clairtone being the most famous one. Talk about that in the book. Anyway, and just it has built a culture in Nova Scotia politics around that. So that Stephen McNeil, for example, spent a great deal of time out of the country, basically as a globe-trotting salesman for the province. And I think it's worth asking, is that what we thought we were getting when we elected him? Somebody who would go to like China every year, or more than once every year, to sell things? The downside, of course, is what you referred to, and that is the Westray explosion in 1992 of the mine in Pictou County. Now, for younger members who don't remember that, to me, that is one of the most seminal events in recent Nova Scotia political history. And that is when the mine in Pictou County blew up, and 26 miners were killed. But significantly, for purposes of public administration, there was a public inquiry that found great deficiencies in the way that the mine had been regulated, and also in the way it had been promoted by politicians. So despite all kinds of warning signs, the mine went ahead, it was built, and many people died. And I think that more than any other single event in our political history created a wave of change, saying, never again, we can't let this happen again. Of course, it didn't happen all at once, didn't happen right away. But that whole economic development story and Westray, I think, is one of the really significant threads running through our political history.
It was very interesting. The heavy water plant in Glace Bay you highlighted as well, that had the potential to probably have some ramifications that never did in the end. And then, of course, we've had Donkin most recently, conversation again around mining. So it seems that tension certainly continues. And historically, it was interesting to watch it play out for different premiers that saw that as a primary drive for them. Okay, so the other thing that you highlight a fair amount that I found really interesting was the shift in power between sort of elected officials and political sort of staffers. So you've got a fair amount of a chapter on I think it was Reagan at the time with that first started to show up. Is that just...
Yeah, that's exactly right, and it is really interesting about who has power in the province, who's really making the decisions. And Angus L. MacDonald, at the end of the day, was pretty much a one-man show, and we talk about that in the book. It's interesting to me. The people around him, even his own cabinet ministers, didn't like him all that much. He wasn't very nice to them. So in the initial video that ran through, you saw a quote from Alexander McKinnon, who was one of his cabinet ministers and later a well-known judge. And he'd said this to another cabinet minister, Harold Connolly. It's just like, there's two Angus L. MacDonalds. There's the one that the people out there think they know, and there's the one that we know. And he didn't mean that as a compliment. Anyway, so Angus L. MacDonald had become premier in 1933 when the government was so small that it was essentially possible to run a government by one person. And then Stanfield was in the same vein. He was a little bit better at delegating. He's had some pretty strong cabinet ministers. And I'll mention in particular G.I. Smith, who went by the nickname Ike Smith, who became premier after Stanfield left, and Dick Donohoe, the father of Terry and Art Donohoe, who some of the people listening to us today may very well have known or remember. So that was more like a strong premier and strong cabinet ministers. But starting with Reagan in 1970, there was a very noticeable shift. For the first time, he hired a lot of people around him, unelected people, paid, unpaid. Some were full-time, some were just, advisors. But that was the beginning of the growth of the premier's office. And for people who know a little bit of the public administration history of the federal government, this is more or less exactly the same time that Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau was doing the same thing at the federal level with a well-known person named Michael Pitfield, who became clerk of the Privy Council. And they essentially did the same thing in Ottawa at the same time. And that tendency to centralize decision-making in the premier's office has gone on unabated, so that I think it's fair to say now that without question, the real decisions are not being made in the legislature. I would argue, based on what I've seen and heard and experienced my own, that it's not really the cabinet that's the decision-making body in government. The key decisions being made in government are being made by the premier and the people around the premier and whoever it is who has the premier's ear. And you can see that tendency working its way through in the history.
Yeah, it was very interesting because, of course, that, being relatively 20 years in this business, it's certainly the power of the political staff has always been a notable feature of the landscape for me. So it was interesting to read back to a time where that wasn't the case.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So moving on to big policy agendas. You talked about, and Savage is the one that specifically stood out to me around, he really was a policy premier that came in with a substantial policy agenda, which hasn't always been the case.
Yeah, that's true. That's what they used to say about John Buchanan, who as a politician was extremely successful, won 4 majority governments, which seems almost inconceivable now. Everybody loved him, but the people who were analyzing were saying, John's just not interested in policy. That's not what he was about. That was not his kind of politics. And I talk about that in the book, where if you're a policy person, Buchanan was the worst premier ever. And if you are just sort of a Main Street politician type, then Buchanan was the best politician ever. Nobody's come even close to him sort of in that respect, about being just a classic handshaking, backslapping Main Street politician. He was really good at that, and I don't mean that as a criticism at all. So, but he had a very personalized style of government. He was very good at patronage. I got a chapter in the book about the phenomenon of patronage, of contracts and jobs being handed out basically to friends of the governing class. And it's impossible to understand Nova Scotia politics without knowing about that. So Buchanan left after 12 years, was kind of mired in scandal. And Donald Cameron became leader a year later and tried to pick things up, but he tried to wipe out the patronage, but his own party didn't like it, and so he wasn't making a lot of headway. And then the Westerly Mine blew up, and to me that is like the seminal event, because that was the end of the Cameron government for all intents and purposes, and really what it was the last straw of the whole Buchanan era and the Buchanan way of doing things. So we had this election in 1993 where the Conservatives under Cameron were decisively thrown out, and this new group came in. They won 50% of the vote, which in a three-party system is like really hard to do. And they came in with this big agenda of policy reform. And as I write about in the book, it was an amazing time for those of us who were there and were watching it. You've aged yourself today, Tracy, and you've told me how long you've been there. So maybe you started just after the Savage years. But if you weren't there, you can't really understand what it was. And I think for people in our audience today who are civil servants or maybe are in school and are thinking they may be civil servants, I really encourage you to take a look back at the Savage era. I really don't think you can understand what's going on in the civil service or in politicians' minds today without knowing what happened during the Savage years. And it's interesting that was the first chapter of the book that I wrote, because in 1994, there was a riot at the legislature. I won't go into all the details of who was rioting or what they were rioting about, but it was an extraordinary scene, an extraordinary situation. And that was under the Savage government, of course. And it was just one of the signs of the deep unpopularity that the Savage government got mired in. After being swept into power, it didn't take them long to annoy, I was going to say piss off, but I don't think I'm supposed to say that out loud. So to annoy just about everybody, because they were changing everything all at the same time. There was municipal amalgamation and hospital amalgamation and this change and that change. And, I think civil servants know that the public, well, civil servants themselves for that matter, have a limited appetite for change. Change is good, but not too much, not too fast. And the Savage government tried to do it all at once. And it has had I believe, a profound effect on the civil service in Nova Scotia, and particularly on politicians' appetite for change, because they saw what happens when a government comes in with a long, deep policy agenda. And of course, for those of you who don't know or don't remember the end of the story, John Savage was essentially forced to resign before the end of his first term because his popularity had plunged so far that the Liberal Party knew they didn't have a hope of re-election unless he left. So that's what happens to a government with a policy agenda. Anyway, it's the first chapter of the book I wrote because that was the thing that was sharpest in my mind. And I would encourage people, even if people can't read the whole book, read that chapter, because I think you'll learn a lot about the public service from that chapter about the Savage years.
As a senior civil servant, always the story of the Savage era has been part of the landscape. But when I actually went through the chapter on Savage and the amount of policy change, so the things that you just referenced, WCB reform, provincial community college consolidation, moving from sort of ambulance chasing to a professionalized paramedic, profession, to have accomplished those things in 3 years-ish, that there would be reeling at that level of change. Now, it did look like the ministers involved were fairly substantial policy ministers as well, based on I think what I was reading in that chapter. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, look, there were some wonderful people in that government. Like any government, there were weak ministers, but there were some really strong ministers. But some of them were good politicians, and some of them were bad politicians. Some of them were strong policy people. Some of them were weak policy people. But it was a pretty amazing government, especially in contrast to what had come before. Because remember, they were like the anti-Buchanan, and so they came in with a very different idea about how government should be done. And 4 years later, Savage was gone, and the popularity had plunged. Now, of course, in the 1998 election, they did hang on to a minority government, barely, they came this close to being thrown out after a single term. So I think that's a lesson that a lot of politicians, liberals too, learned is change is fine, but not too much and not too fast.
Yeah, and the Savage era really took the Liberals out of commission for quite a long stretch.
Yeah,
so,
it did. They were in the wilderness for, what was it, 14 years. Yeah.
Yeah, if that's not a cautionary tale, I don't know what is. Okay, so all things diversity and inclusion. So there's two themes that come through in the book. There's both diversity at the population level, so African Nova Scotians and how long it's been historically before representation started to be present. Women in the legislature was certainly a tone, and then on top of that, is the piece that really is what I call environmental racism, so triggered by Boat Harbor and some other things. Do you look back on that time and see a point historically where there was a bit of acceleration happening, say, on the women in politics front?
Yeah, let me back up a little bit. I want to explain to people how this works. Okay, I'm obviously an older white guy, and so I was very conscious of the fact that the way I was structuring the book, I wanted to tell a story that was interesting to people for a general audience. Didn't want to go too deep, in any one era. I didn't want to get lost in a swamp of dollar signs, and so I wanted to tell a lively story. And the best way for me to hang the story together so that there was some kind of forward momentum was to focus on the premiers. I didn't mean to do that when I started out, but I realized as I was writing that was the only way really to keep the forward momentum going. But the problem, of course, is that the premiers of Nova Scotia had been a string of white men. And so I knew I couldn't stop there. I couldn't tell that story and just say, okay, there's your history. And so I very consciously, there is the chapters are named after people by and large. Well, there's one on patronage, there's one on roads, there's one on jobs, but other than that, they're named after people. Except, and only one of them is a person who was not a premier, and that is that there's a whole chapter on Donald Marshall Jr. And I thought that was really significant. I'm not, as you refer to in your introduction, Tracy, I'm not a native Nova Scotian. I was born and raised in Winnipeg. I came to Dalhousie to go to law school and stayed in Nova Scotia for 35 years. But when I was in law school in the late 1980s is exactly when the Marshall inquiry was looking into the wrongful conviction of Donald Marshall. And I've already said that I think the single most seminal event in Nova Scotia recent political history is the Westray explosion and the follow through on that. But the second one certainly would be the Marshall inquiry. I was there I was in law school, so obviously this was of great interest to me. And that inquiry, which was handled, Royal Commission it was at the time, was handled so well. And the report is so thorough and well written that too upended the coziness of Nova Scotia politics, because it contrasted, for example, the treatment of Donald Marshall Jr. with the treatment a couple of politicians had got when they got into some trouble. Obviously they received much more favored treatment than Donald Marshall did, and the inquiry was going on, and it really the echoes of that inquiry, that commission, are still felt today in the effect that it has had on, especially on the justice system, but also on certain aspects of the civil service. Well, just to name one obvious thing, the fact that the prosecution service is now separate from the Department of Justice. That's a direct result of the Marshall inquiry. So I have, and then so that all by itself makes Donald Marshall Jr. a very significant person in Nova Scotia's political history. And then he was the plaintiff, the defendant, I should say, because it was a criminal case, not a civil case. He was a defendant in a fishing case, which raised the issue of, well, what do those long ago treaties mean? What are the treaty rights of the Mi'kmaq of Nova Scotia? And that went all the way to the Supreme Court of Canada. And again, had a profound effect in establishing the baseline of the law. And so, although Donald Marshall Jr. was never a politician, he never ran for public office, his impact in Nova Scotia in those two ways has been so significant that I thought he deserved a chapter on his own. And I thought it belonged in this book because even though he wasn't a politician, he's had a profound change in two ways, two separate ways, on Nova Scotia's government and politics. I also was conscious of the fact that by telling the story of Nova Scotia's premiers, that it was focused on men. So I do have a whole chapter devoted to women in Nova Scotia politics. And it's interesting, Tracy, when I talk to especially younger women, they are shocked at how recently it was that we had these breakthroughs, you know, like the first female MLA, the first female cabinet minister, for heaven's sake, was only the late 1980s. Late 1980s, I mean, to me, to an old guy like me, that's like yesterday. And we're still nowhere close to parity in the legislature. But one of the things that I did mention is that women have held a very significant number of senior roles as chiefs of staff, you know, and equivalent positions, so around the premier. So they haven't held the premier's position, but they've held positions that are very close to the premier. And I thought it was worth outlining. So because of that chapter, there's probably just as many women mentioned in the book as there are men. And the final thing I'll say on that point is that the glorious thing is that, you know, I'm not the only one writing on this topic. And while I was writing, two young women wrote a book about, Grace Evans and Sarah Dobson wrote a book called On Their Shoulders, which is the first 50 women elected to the Nova Scotia legislature. And the key thing is in their own words. And it's a really wonderful book. And if people haven't heard of it, I really encourage you to pick it up. They self-published, so it's a little harder to find than my book, but it's called On Their Shoulders, Dobson and Evans. And it's really quite a wonderful addition to the Nova Scotia bookshelf, something that was up till then like completely missing.
Yeah, thanks for that. That might be next on my nightstand. And the other, you know, thing that can't be discounted is the right to moderate living is still very much alive right now, both federally and provincially. So that conversation will continue for some years yet, I expect.
For people who are not, maybe for people who are younger than me, which is just about everybody these days, who aren't familiar with the Donald Marshall story. See, I feel like I kind of grew up with the Donald Marshall story because it was all going on when I first arrived in Nova Scotia. But if you're not familiar with it, really dig into it. Just the most amazing life. And if I could mention another book, his former domestic partner, Jane McMillan, wrote a book, which is really a wonderful book, and which is easily the best book on Donald Marshall Jr. Just off the top of my head, I don't remember the title, but Jane McMillan is her name, MCM McMillan. And one of the things I've done, I appreciate when an author has like an annotated bibliography saying, hey, if this stuff interests you and you want to read more, here's the good stuff and here's the stuff to stay away from. So at the end of my book, there's an annotated bibliography where I talk about Jane McMillan's book and other things like these are the good books, these are the good sources, these are the not so good sources. And hopefully people will find that interesting as well.
And Jane was the woman that was with Donald Marshall when he was charged for illegal fishing. Is that not right?
Exactly. And one of the fascinating, now, of course, this may be, but for me as a lawyer, one of the fascinating things is that the Supreme Court of Canada, of course, wrote a decision about Mi'kmaq treaty rights, and they got that wrong. In the very first line of the decision, they say that two Mi'kmaq Indians, their boat slid into the water in Pomquet Harbor. And it's like, that's not true. That's not what happened. Anyway, Jane tells a story in her own words. She was there, and that's, I think, and she's also an academic, so she can come at it from both the personal angle and the academic angle, and has written really quite a wonderful book, which I recommend to anybody who'd like to know more about this fascinating and impactful person in Nova Scotia's political history, Donald Marshall Jr.
Thank you for the couple of books there we added to the list. So the next thing I have to tell you was very naive of me to have not known more apparently than I did. But in the appendix of your book, the first appendix, you've got a chronology of the premiers and the governments and the number of seats they held during the years that you covered. I think it was not on my radar just how few minority governments Nova Scotia has had in the time frame of your book. So can you reflect, Graham, a little bit on the circumstances in which Nova Scotia did have a minority government during that time, and for how long? So I thought that was interesting. We're not very good at it. It doesn't last very long.
It is totally interesting. And of course, you're more likely to have a minority government when you have three relatively strong parties. I mean, you might have a minority government by luck, if you have a third weak party. But so the stronger the NDP got, the more likely it was that you were going to have a minority government. Now, there was technically a minority for a short time in 1970. I won't go into the details of that, but let's just say that for all practical purposes, it was a majority. But the minorities were, of course, when the NDP had this big breakthrough in 1998, when they went from 4 seats to 19, and they ended up being tied with Russell McClelland's Liberals. So that was a minority government. And then John Hamm won a majority, and then a minority, and then Rodney MacDonald won another minority. So basically, I have trouble saying this, but the first decade of this century, I'll call the aughts, which I think is a horribly awkward word, but most of the aughts was a minority government. And that, of course, included my time in the legislature. So I served under a majority government in opposition and in government, and then to minority government. And I can tell you that at least in the legislature, they are profoundly different, because the government can't move anything forward without having at least one of the other parties voting with them. And it led to some pretty significant changes. Well, I don't want to exaggerate, because they were still the government, and they ignored us when they could. But it did lead to a very, very noticeable change in the way things worked in the legislature. But since then, since 2013, we've gone back to majority governments. But here's the interesting thing, Tracy, is that Tim Houston won a majority government with the lowest share of the vote that anybody has ever won a majority government with. So back in, MacDonald and Stanfield's day, when there's essentially two parties and a very weak, NDP or CCF as it was back then, to win government, you needed to get pretty darn close to 50%. But Tim Houston had, I forget the exact number, but it was somewhere in the neighborhood of 38%. And it's like, that's really interesting that you can have a majority government, and so you get your own way all the time, and only 38% of the population has voted for you. So it's something to keep an eye on. And one of the things that I noticed, you said this was news to you, but it was news to me too, when I put all the numbers together, that it takes only a very slight change to change, minority to majority, or which party forms the government, because most people vote the same way all the time. So everybody's fighting over the people who maybe might change the vote. And I explain that a little bit in an appendix at the end of my book.
Yeah, and so you play with, throughout the whole book, this concept of the population starting to feel like it's time for a change. It's time for a change. It's time for a change.
Time for a change.
So there's a bit of a fickleness to that kind of that feeling. And when you look through that appendix, when you see it actually broken down by year, that time for change is seldomly more than kind of 6-ish years, as you start to see a shift into possibly a minority government, and then things sort of shift. So, it does.
It used to be longer. It used to be longer, but nowadays, you're right. It's people's patience is getting shorter, and I'm probably exhibit A in that, because of course our government got tossed out after one term. But yeah, people's patience is getting shorter, and of course premiers are not staying around as long as they used to. I mean, John Hamm resigned after only 6 years. Stephen McNeil resigned after, 7 years. Whereas Angus L. MacDonald became premier in 1933 and was still premier when he died in 1954. So yeah, the timeframes are getting shorter for sure, which is also a very interesting thing. People are throwing out their governments more than they used to.
Well, and I do wonder how that will shift as we modernize election capability, and when there comes a time that people can vote online, and so much more of the vote is done weeks before the actual election, and how that will change things over time as
Yeah.
well.
The other thing that I noticed, I mentioned, Tracy, that I had a chapter about corruption. Well, maybe I didn't. I had patronage and also corruption, mainly vote buying. So I got a whole chapter on that because, again, you can't really understand Nova Scotia politics without that. But it's really interesting that the vote buying phenomenon really came to an end around the 1993 election, which was like the break between Buchanan, Cameron, and Savage. And that's when the voter turnout started dropping, right? I show the chart in the book, and like maybe it's a coincidence, but I don't think so, because it used to be that what I call the marginal voter, the voter who didn't really have a good reason to vote, well, if they were going to get $5 or a bottle of rum for it, yeah, they'd go out and vote. And once that kind of like getting a gift in exchange for voting stopped, which it did more or less around 1993. Those marginal voters, I think, have drifted away. I can't prove it. It's not by its nature a provable hypothesis, but it's really interesting to see the correlation anyway between the end of vote buying and the steady drop in voter turnout.
Yes. So what I know and why that's relevant to me is that I certainly grew up in Tatamagouche, if you know where that is, along the North Shore. And certainly the being picked up to go and vote was a part of the landscape in my hometown. Absolutely. And by the time I was legal age to vote, I was waiting for someone to come pick me up and give me my pint of rum or my pair of nylons, as it was for the women.
It's interesting, you've told the story. That's really interesting. Like when we're offline, I want to hear the details. But one of the things I want to mention is, so the sources for my book, there's been a lot of really good writing, but sort of all over the place. And I tried to gather it all together, the books, the scholarly articles, but also I dug into some pretty good like master's and PhD theses, which I think is like an untapped resource for a lot of really good information. I was also able to get some memoirs that had not been previously published, particularly from former Premier Harold Connolly, but also Fraser Mooney Sr., who was a longtime MLA for Yarmouth. But the other thing I did, because I'd been in politics and because I'd been a commentator on CBC, I have a lot of Facebook followers who are interested in politics. And I asked them for stories, just like the one you told me. And so my book has been really enriched by including some of the best of the stories that I got from people all around the province. My book touches on really every corner of the province. It's definitely not Halifax centric, and that's like on purpose, because I know that's not what people want. Mm-hmm. But I got some wonderful stories about vote buying, yes, although a lot of people aren't willing to name names because some of the people involved are still alive, even though it happened a long time ago. But I have a story in the book about a cow and a helicopter and about somebody trading in their sports car for a new Volvo. And all of those stories came from, ordinary citizens who were just interested and were kind enough to share their stories with me and to let me use them in the book. Because I used them because I thought they illustrated something important about the political characters involved.
Yes, and I don't know that anyone at that time would have viewed that to have been anything other than, normal behavior. So that's how far things can come in a fairly short period of time. So I know that we are going to move to Q&As here in a second.
Yeah.
Okay, I think, Tom, are you coming my way, or do I have time for another question? You're coming our way with some questions? Okay.
Yeah, I think I'm going to butt in.
Okay.
So just as a reminder for everyone watching, we are taking questions. And if you do have a question for Graham, please feel free to post it in the YouTube chat. We've had some great ones already, so we'll just work our way through the list. So the first one is from Sam McPhail. Hi, Graham. In your opinion, who is the best premier Nova Scotia never had?
Oh, I love that. I love that question. Now, first of all, let me say one of the appendices in my book is Nova Scotia's top 10 politicians, but in order to keep it manageable, they had to be people who've served at least one term as an MLA. And I'll leave people to read that because I had some very lively debates with my Facebook friends about who should be on the list. Some of them are obvious, some of them less obvious. But in my book, I actually do name a particular person. And of course, I could say, well, if you want to know, you got to buy my book. But I'll tell you now that the person I actually name in the book is Neil LeBlanc, the MLA for Argyll. He was a minister during the Buchanan years and then came back later and served as a senior minister in the Ham government. When John Ham retired, he ran for the leadership of the Conservative Party and was widely expected to win. He certainly was a favorite. And when the ballots were counted among the three contenders, he came third. So to the dismay of his supporters, he dropped off the ballot on the first round. And I have a great deal of respect for Neil. He's got a great deal of ability. And we can wonder what would have happened if he had won. And if I could say another one, it might be Don Down, who ran against John Savage for the leadership in 1993. It was pretty clear that whoever won the Liberal leadership after Vince McLean resigned was going to be the next premier of the province. And Savage and Down were just two very different people. And the Savage years were this tumult of change, this hurricane of reform. And I just wonder what would have happened if Don Down had been the premier instead. So those would be my top two picks.
Great.
Oh, and if somebody said, what about the NDP? I'd have to say Robert Chisholm, in my opinion. I don't care if people think I'm biased. He would have been a great premier. Tons of ability. I'm really sorry that he never had the chance. Hope that answers your question.
Great. So we had another one from Alison McNeil. It's interesting that you have experience in both politics and public admin. How would you say your experience in politics informed your public service career, or vice versa?
Oh, that's an excellent question. So for people who don't know, I was the lawyer for the Workers' Compensation Board from 1993 to 1998. So obviously a government entity, but not sort of core civil service. So that's what I count as my civil service experience. And frankly, it helped me a great deal when I was when I got into politics, because I had been in the bureaucracy for 5 years. I'd been involved in the drafting of legislation, the Reformed Workers' Compensation Act, and I basically had this idea about how the public service of Nova Scotia moved and how it thought and what the dynamic was. Now, a lot of people get into politics who have no idea about any of that stuff, and they either have to learn it, or if they don't learn it, it really hampers their ability to effect change. And so when I moved over onto the political side, I definitely took advantage of that experience, particularly when I was an MLA doing casework, which is, especially in opposition or if you're a government backbencher, is what you spend a lot of your time doing, acting as an ombudsman for people who need help with the government, like with community services. Right. And that experience I had in a large, high volume decision-making entity like the Workers' Compensation Board was a tremendous help to me to help my constituents. So those are the ways that I would say it helped. It was a tremendous advantage to me that I had that previous experience.
Okay, great. So we have another one here from Krista Spur. What surprised you the most about Nova Scotia politics as you researched this book?
Oh, what surprised me the most? I think even for me, I knew the broad outlines of Nova Scotia politics, but this project really let me delve into it. And I think one of the things that surprised me, Krista, was the patterns that I'd never noticed before. But when you look, in detail at a stretch of 75 years, you say, oh, that's interesting. Like, I didn't really realize the patterns that you see developing. Let me just give you one example, and it may be a superficial example, but it illustrates the point that I'm making. And that is, I had not realized until I did the research for the book that it's really difficult for a party in government to change leaders and win the next election. Like I just didn't know that. And Nova Scotians, especially in the early days, seemed to be happy with who they had until they left. And then it was like, okay, out you go. So when Angus L. MacDonald died, Harold Connolly became premier briefly, then Henry Hicks. They lost the next election. When Stanfield went into federal politics, Ike Smith took over, very, very capable and accomplished guy. Next election, out they go. And so that continues on. So when Buchanan left, Cameron took over after a brief period with Roger Bacon. Out they went, and it just continued. Now Russell McClellan and Rodney MacDonald at least were able to win minorities, but in the run up to the last Nova Scotia election, I was able to say to people, this is in the time that my book had just come out, and I was able to say to people, there's like a curse of Nova Scotia politics where you just can't hand the leadership from one person to another. Now, I wasn't exactly predicting the election outcome, but it made me look pretty good as if that's exactly what I'd done, because, the Liberals passed the baton from Stephen McNeil to Ian Rankin, and what do you know? Out they go. So the curse is still there. And that was frankly not something that I'd even known was a thing until I did the research for the book. And yeah, I could probably give you other examples, but that's a pretty good one. It's just seeing the patterns. The technology changes, the names change, but there's a lot of similarities in the patterns, which is why I think today's civil servants can really benefit from learning what happened 20 years ago or 40 years ago, so that you can recognize those patterns and say, aha, I know, I see what's going on here.
That's really interesting. Thanks. So we have Adele's, and then we'll probably get one more in. If you could pick a previous premier who would have been well suited to leading during a pandemic, who would it have been and why? Apart from the couple who recently did.
Oh, that's a that's a tough one. But I think the premiers who really excelled during the pandemic were the people who could talk to the population, tell them what they needed to know. I happen to think that Stephen McNeil excelled at it because he had what people needed, which is like what you might call the stern but kind father. He's compassionate, but when he needed to be stern, he was stern. It's interesting, like Nunavut here had a really good communicator as premier, a gentleman by the name of Joe Savikatak. And he was able to relate to the audience that he was speaking to really well. And I think that's the trait that you need more than anything else. So probably I would say of all the premiers that I knew about or read about, the people who could do that, who could say what needed to be said, but to still support people, it would probably be Robert Stanfield. Going back to Chris's question, one of the things that surprised me is I'm amazed, Stanfield hasn't been a premier of Nova Scotia since 1967. That's a long time ago. And people still come forward with stories about what a gentle and kind person he was. And, like the cow story that opens the Stanfield chapter. And he was a very smart man as well, highly educated, very, very sharp, but just a very kind and compassionate person. I think he would have been really good at being premier during COVID.
From what I've read in your book, I agree. And we just, because I know we're getting close to time, so we'll just do one more question. Graham, what do you have in mind for book number 4?
Okay, so there's this murder mystery, which I've been talking about for 10 years. And it's but it's still all in my head. I got to get it out of my head and onto the page. So everybody's at Province House, and I can't quite decide if it's a storm or a huge demonstration where everybody gets stuck in Province House. So it's like an Agatha Christie mystery where everybody's in the same place and can't get out, but it's in Province House because it's such a wonderful, fantastic. It's a 200-year-old building with all these nooks and crannies. I've been up to the attic and down to the basement. It's just this fantastic setting for a murder mystery. The premier is found dead because it's politics. Everybody has a motive to kill the premier, right? And somebody steps up and solves the mystery. Meanwhile, one party is barricaded in the legislative chamber. The other party is barricaded in the red room across the hallway. And anyway, that's the setting, but I can't quite figure out yet who did it. But anyway, that's before I die, I have to write that book because it's been rattling around in my brain for so long.
Looking forward to
Probably
it.
not what you expected, was it?
No.
Oh, and what is the name? There is a book. There's a couple of books written. I can't remember the name of the book or the author, but it's kind of set in Ottawa, and it's McClintock. Is this unlikely?
Terry Fallis. Yeah, Terry Fallis books.
Yeah. So it kind of started him with that rice boat that he goes flying up in the middle of the snowstorm. Reminds me.
Yeah. So I can't. I told you that the original idea of the publisher was an irreverent history, and I can't quite decide, what tone to take with my murder mystery. But I'm gonna write it, and I don't know if it's gonna be like funny or like straight up. But it's like I have to write it because the plot's been rattling around for so long. I got to get it out of my head and onto the page.
Pen to paper.
Yeah.
Exactly.
So either that or a history of the politics of Nunavut, but I don't think there's a lot of going to be a big market for that.
Well, there could be if you keep talking about it on things like this with enough people listening. I think we're almost wrapping up, but I would ask you one question if I can before we go.
Okay, I promise a short answer. Yeah.
What did you contemplate that might be a chapter in this book, but wasn't? You've done specifically a chapter on sort of women in politics and one on sort of corruption, one on Donald Marshall. Was there any other chapters that you thought might sort of warrant their own digging?
No, I don't think so. But what I would say is that I got so many wonderful stories about, just from people, especially through Facebook. I would have liked to have been able to include more of them. That's if there's something that's like missing that I could have added, that would be it. But I had an idea from the beginning about how long the book should be. I didn't want it to be intimidating. I wanted it to be very readable. I wanted it to be for a general audience who maybe feel like they should know something about politics and political history, but aren't really like into politics. And I think I did that. And so, the book I think couldn't be any longer than it actually is, but the stories that people shared with me were quite wonderful, and it would have been nice for me to be able to include more of them.
Well, it was, I think I'm about to hand it off here in a second, but I found the book to be very fact-based, very full of civility. I just thought it was such a diplomatic assessment of history. And certainly the patterns I found were coming through to me loud and clear throughout. I was doing lots of, this was like this, and this is like that, and other experiences that I've had. So I really enjoyed the read. Thank you. Thank you for writing it, and thanks for the chat today.
Thanks so much. It's been a riveting discussion, and I really wish we had more time. And I'm thinking Rosie Barton might want to bring this team on her show, maybe host from Province House. But on behalf of IPAC Nova Scotia, I really hope that everyone enjoyed this event and want to thank everybody for their attention and their questions. Tracy, thank you to you for your moderation, and to Graham for joining us for this overview of your book and the political history of Nova Scotia. Is there an audiobook component to this?
I'm afraid not. Not yet. Not yet. If more people bought it, maybe I could convince the publisher.
Well, that would be great. Thank you. And thank you to Tom for running the Q&A today. So for everyone, remember, if you haven't read Graham's book yet, you really should. And of course, if you haven't become a member of IPAC yet, please consider doing that. Our next event will be hosted in April, and we're looking forward to seeing you there. Good night, everyone.